I should have known better than to stick out my thumb on that lonely stretch of highway. But after walking for hours under the scorching sun, my water bottle empty and my feet aching, the sight of that 18-wheeler approaching in the distance felt like salvation. The massive truck slowed as it neared, the brakes hissing as it pulled onto the shoulder. I jogged towards the passenger side, my backpack bouncing uncomfortably against my sweaty back. The door swung open, and I was greeted by a blast of air conditioning and the smiling face of a man in his 50s, his trucker cap pulled low over graying hair. "Where you headed, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. "Asheville," I replied, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Or anywhere in that direction, really." He chuckled. "Well, hop on in. I'm going straight through to Charlotte. We can get you to Asheville, no problem." I climbed up into the cab, marveling at how high off the ground we were. The trucker introduced himself as Bill and offered me a cold bottle of water from a cooler behind his seat. As I gulped it down gratefully, he eased the big rig back onto the highway. For the first hour or so, everything was great. Bill was friendly and talkative, telling me stories about life on the road and asking about my own travels. The miles flew by and I started to relax, thinking about how lucky I'd been to catch this ride. It wasn't until we passed the exit for Asheville that the first prickle of unease crept up my spine. "Hey, Bill," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Wasn't that the turnoff for Asheville back there?" He glanced at me, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "Oh yeah, sorry about that. I forgot you wanted off there. Tell you what, we'll catch the next exit and I'll turn around. It's not far." I nodded, settling back into my seat, but as we continued down the highway, that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger. One exit passed, then another. Bill made no move to slow down or change lanes. We just passed another exit," I pointed out, unable to keep the tension from my voice. Bill's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Yeah, I know. Look, kid, change of plans. I've got a delivery I need to make first. It won't take long, and then I'll get you where you need to go." My heart began to race. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was overreacting. "I really need to get to Asheville," I said, forcing a smile. "How about you just let me out at the next exit? I can catch another ride from there." Bill shook his head. "No can do. Like I said, I've got a delivery to make. You'll just have to sit tight for a bit longer." I fell silent, my mind racing. The friendly trucker from earlier was gone, replaced by a stone-faced stranger who refused to look at me. I discreetly checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. The shadows lengthened as the afternoon wore on. We'd been driving for hours now, far beyond where we should have been. The highway had given way to smaller roads, then to gravel paths winding through dense forest. I had no idea where we were anymore. "Bill," I said, no longer bothering to hide the fear in my voice. "Where are we going? What's really going on here?" He remained silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, kid, I really am, but I don't have a choice." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "What don't you have a choice about?" Before he could answer, we rounded a bend and I saw it, a ramshackle cabin set back from the road, surrounded by rusted-out cars and overgrown weeds. Bill slowed the truck, turning onto a dirt driveway that led up to the building. Panic seized me. I grabbed for the door handle, ready to jump out even if it meant injury. But Bill was faster. His hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Don't," he warned. "You'll only make it worse for yourself." As we pulled up in front of the cabin, the door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, his face hidden in the shadows of the setting sun, but I could see the shotgun in his hands clear as day. "This him?" the man called out. Bill nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah, this is the one." The man with the shotgun grinned, revealing a mouth full of rotting teeth. "Good work, Bill. Bring him inside." I struggled as Bill dragged me from the truck, my mind reeling. What did they want with me? Why had they gone to such lengths to bring me here? As we neared the porch, I could smell the reek of unwashed bodies and stale alcohol coming from inside the cabin. "Please," I begged Bill. "You don't have to do this. Whatever they have on you, we can figure it out. We can go to the police." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then the man with the shotgun stepped forward, pressing the barrel against my chest. "Inside," he growled. Now, with Bill's grip on one arm and the shotgun trained on me, I had no choice but to enter the dim interior of the cabin. The smell was even worse inside, a mixture of rot and despair that made my stomach churn. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw shapes moving in the shadows. More men, at least 3 or 4 of them. "Well, well," one of them said, stepping into a shaft of light from a dirty window. "Looks like our guest of honor has arrived." I stared at him in confusion and growing horror. There was something familiar about his face, like a half-remembered nightmare. And then it hit me. I knew where I'd seen him before. It was on a poster in the post office back home, a wanted poster, for a man suspected of multiple kidnappings and murders across 3 states. As the realization dawned, I saw the gleam of anticipation in his eyes. He knew that I recognized him. He was enjoying my fear. "Welcome," he said, spreading his arms wide, "to your new home." The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the damp air of the cabin. New home? What did he mean? How long were they planning to keep me here? I turned to Bill, desperation clawing at my throat. "You can't leave me here," I pleaded. "You know what they're going to do to me. How can you be a part of this?" Bill wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, kid," he mumbled. "They've got my family. If I don't do what they say..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. The leader, I couldn't think of him as anything else, laughed. "That's right, Billy boy, you've done your job. Now get out of here. We'll call when we need you again." Bill hesitated for a moment, conflict written across his face, but in the end, self-preservation won out. He turned and walked out of the cabin without looking back. I listened to the sound of his truck starting up, then fading into the distance, taking with it my last hope of rescue. "Now then," the leader said, turning his attention back to me. "Let's get you settled in, shall we?" As 2 of his men grabbed my arms, I realized with sickening clarity that this was really happening. This wasn't some bad dream I was going to wake up from. This was my new reality. I thought about my family, probably just starting to worry about why I hadn't checked in. I thought about my friends, my plans for the future, all the things I'd taken for granted. And I thought about how easily it had all been snatched away, all because I'd made the mistake of trusting a stranger on the side of the road. As they dragged me towards a door that I assumed led to some kind of cellar or basement, I made a silent vow to myself. I would survive this. Somehow, some way, I would find a way to escape. And when I did, I would make sure that Bill and every one of these monsters faced justice for what they'd done. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. As they shoved me forward, I took one last look at the fading daylight through the cabin's grimy windows. Then the door slammed shut behind me, and I was swallowed by the dark. The longest ride of my life had come to an end, but my fight for survival was just beginning. Story 2. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the flat tire and the frustrated driver standing beside it. Just another routine stop on Highway 16, or so I thought. I had no idea that in a few moments my entire world would be turned upside down. I'd been with the Highway Patrol for 15 years, and nights like this were as familiar to me as my own reflection. The red and blue lights of my cruiser painted the empty stretch of road in alternating colors, a silent disco for the coyotes and tumbleweeds. I stepped out of my vehicle, gravel crunching under my boots. "Evening, sir," I called out, approaching the stranded motorist. "Having some trouble, The man turned to face me, relief washing over his features. He was middle-aged, with a receding hairline and a paunch that spoke of too many meals on the road. "Oh, thank God," he said. "I've been out here for an hour. Cell service is non-existent." I nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, it's a dead zone out here. Let's take a look at that tire, shall we?" As I knelt to inspect the damage, I noticed the man fidgeting, his eyes darting between me and the trunk of his car. It wasn't unusual for people to be nervous around cops, but something about his behavior set my teeth on edge. "Looks like you've got a blowout," I said, standing up. "You got a spare?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, in the trunk. I couldn't get it open, though. The latch seems to be stuck." I raised an eyebrow. "Mind if I take a look?" "No," he said, a bit too forcefully. Then catching himself, "I mean, it's fine. I'm sure I can manage now that you're here." My hand instinctively moved closer to my holster. 15 years on the job teaches you to trust your gut, and right now mine was screaming that something was very, very wrong. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." He hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Officer, please. There's no need for—" "Step away from the vehicle," I repeated, my tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, he complied, moving to stand by the passenger side door. I approached the trunk, my senses on high alert. The man's eyes never left me as I reached for the latch. It opened easily. The smell hit me first, a sickening mixture of copper and decay that made my stomach lurch. As my flashlight beam fell on the contents of the trunk, I felt the world tilt on its axis. A body, small, crumpled, wrapped in a blood-stained blanket. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In all my years on the force, I'd seen some horrible things, but this was something else entirely. The sound of running feet snapped me back to reality. The driver was making a break for it, sprinting towards the darkness beyond the reach of my cruiser's lights. "Stop! Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon and giving chase. He was faster than he looked, fueled by desperation. But I had training and adrenaline on my side. I closed the distance between us, tackling him to the ground in a cloud of dust. "You don't understand," he wheezed as I cuffed him. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean to." "Save it," I growled, hauling him to his feet. "You have the right to remain silent. Use it." As I marched him back to my cruiser, my mind was racing. Who was the victim in the trunk? How long had they been dead? Were there others? I radioed for backup and forensics, my voice sounding strangely calm despite the turmoil in my head. As I recited the details of the situation, I couldn't shake the image of that small, lifeless form. The wait for backup felt like an eternity. I kept the driver secured in the back of my cruiser, pointedly avoiding looking at him. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the open trunk of his car. I knew I shouldn't disturb the scene any further, but something compelled me to look again. Maybe I needed to confirm that what I'd seen was real, that this nightmare was actually happening. As I approached, I steeled myself for the sight and the smell, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. The blanket had shifted slightly, revealing a pale, tiny hand. And on that hand, a glint of metal caught my flashlight beam. A bracelet. A small silver charm bracelet with a heart-shaped pendant. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I knew that bracelet. I'd bought it myself just 2 months ago for my niece's 10th birthday. The world spun around me as the horrifying truth sank in. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was personal. This was family. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. How? Why? The questions battered at my mind like a storm, each one bringing a fresh wave of pain and disbelief. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was almost here. Soon, this quiet stretch of highway would be swarming with cops and crime scene techs. They'd take over, do their jobs, follow procedure. But in that moment, as I stood there with my world crumbling around me, procedure was the furthest thing from my mind. I turned slowly, my gaze fixing on the cruiser where the driver sat. He stared back at me, his eyes wide with fear. He must have seen something in my face, some flicker of recognition or flash of grief, because he started shaking his head frantically. "Officer, please," he called out, his voice muffled by the closed windows. "It's not what you think. I can explain." I walked towards the cruiser, my movements mechanical. Each step felt like I was wading through molasses, the weight of my grief and rage threatening to drag me under. As I reached for the door handle, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings about protocol, about due process, about the consequences of acting on emotion. But it was drowned out by the roaring in my ears, by the image of that little silver bracelet burned into my retinas. I opened the door. The driver flinched away from me, pressing himself against the far side of the back seat. "Please," he whimpered. "You have to listen to me. It was an accident. I never meant to hurt anyone." I stood there, framed in the doorway, my hand resting on my holster. In that moment, I understood how thin the line was between law enforcer and vigilante. I could so easily step over it, could make this man pay for what he'd done. No one would question it too closely. A suspect tried to escape, reached for my gun. These things happen. The sirens were so close now, their wail drowning out everything else. I had seconds to decide to choose what kind of man I was going to be. I took a deep breath, then another. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down and grasped the driver's arm, pulling him out of the cruiser. "What are you doing?" he stammered, looking wildly between me and the approaching lights of the backup units. "My job," I said, my voice hollow. As the first backup unit screeched to a halt beside us, I recited the Miranda rights, each word tasting like ash in my mouth. I handed the driver over to my confused colleagues, giving them a brief rundown of the situation. I watched as they led him away as the crime scene tech swarmed around the car with its grisly cargo. I answered questions on autopilot, my responses clipped and professional. But inside I was screaming. Inside I was dying right along with the little girl in that trunk. As dawn broke over the highway, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sat on the hood of my cruiser, staring at nothing. The scene had been processed. The body taken away, the suspect transported to county lockup. There was nothing left for me to do here. And yet I couldn't bring myself to leave, to drive away and pretend that the world was the same as it had been when I'd started my shift. A hand on my shoulder startled me out of my thoughts. It was my sergeant, his face etched with concern. "Go home, John," he said softly. "We've got this covered. You've done enough." I nodded numbly, sliding off the hood. As I reached for my car door, he spoke again. "John, it's not your fault. Remember that." I didn't respond. Couldn't. I just got in my cruiser and started the engine. As I pulled away from the scene, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at me was a stranger's, older, harder, haunted by ghosts that would never leave. I'd started this night thinking it was just another routine stop. Now, nothing would ever be routine again. The highway stretched out before me, empty and unforgiving. Somewhere down that road, a family was about to receive the worst news of their lives, and I was the one who would have to deliver it. Just another day on the job. God help me. Story 3. The neon sign of Luigi's Pizzeria flickered in the corner of my eye as I secured the steaming box to my bike rack. It was my last delivery of the night, and the autumn chill had already settled into my bones. I should have been relieved, eager to finish up and head home. Instead, a sense of unease crawled up my spine as I glanced at the delivery address on my phone. 1242 Sycamore Lane. It was in that old industrial district, the one that had been mostly abandoned since the factory shut down a decade ago. Not the kind of place that usually ordered pizza at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. I shook off the feeling. Money was money, and I needed every cent I could get if I wanted to make rent this month. With a resigned sigh, I kicked off, pedaling into the night. The streets grew quieter as I left the bustling downtown area behind. Streetlights became fewer and farther between, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. The only sounds were the whir of my bike chain and the occasional distant bark of a dog. As I turned onto Maple Street, the last populated road before the industrial zone, I noticed a car idling at the curb. Its headlights were off, but I could see the glow of a cigarette inside. The driver's face was hidden in shadow, but I felt their eyes on me as I rode by. Probably nothing, I told myself, just someone having a late-night smoke. But the prickle of unease returned, stronger this time. I picked up my pace, the box of pizza jostling in its carrier. The warmth it had provided earlier was long gone, replaced by a clammy chill that seemed to seep into my clothes. The transition to the industrial area was abrupt. One moment I was passing darkened houses and closed shops. The next I was surrounded by looming warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. Graffiti covered nearly every surface, garish designs barely visible in the dim light. 1242 Sycamore Lane turned out to be a squat brick building with boarded-up windows. No lights were on, and there was no sign of life. I double-checked the address on my phone, but there was no mistake. This was the place. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the pizza box. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to pedal away as fast as I could. But I needed this job. I couldn't afford to start turning down deliveries, no matter how sketchy they seemed. With a deep breath, I unclipped the box and approached the building. There was no doorbell, so I knocked, the sound echoing ominously in the empty street. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hello, pizza delivery." Still nothing. I was about to give up and call it in as a prank order when I heard it. A faint scraping sound from inside the building, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice wavering slightly. Is someone there? I've got your pizza." The scraping stopped abruptly. Then so quietly I almost missed it, I heard footsteps. They were uneven, shuffling, moving slowly towards the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited. The street behind me suddenly seemed very dark and very empty. I found myself wishing for the idling car from earlier, for any sign of another human presence. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the door. There was a long pause, then a voice, low and raspy. "Leave it on the step. Money's under the mat." I blinked in surprise. "Sir, I'm sorry, but company policy says I have to hand the pizza directly to the customer. Can you please open the door?" Another long pause, then, "No, just leave it and go." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was very wrong here. I took a step back, clutching the pizza box like a shield. "I'm sorry, but I can't do that. If you don't want to open the door, I'll have to take the pizza back." A sound came from behind the door then, a sort of choked laugh that made my skin crawl. "You're not going anywhere, kid." Before I could react, the door burst open. A figure lunged out, moving far faster than the shuffling footsteps had suggested. I caught a glimpse of wild eyes and unkempt hair before something hit me hard in the chest, sending me sprawling onto the sidewalk. The pizza box went flying, its contents spilling across the cracked concrete. I scrambled backwards, my hands scraping against rough pavement as I tried to put distance between myself and my attacker. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with matted hair and clothes that hung loosely on his frame. But what terrified me most was the look in his eyes. A desperate, feral hunger that had nothing to do with pizza. "I'm sorry," he growled, advancing on me. "I didn't want to do it this way. But I'm so hungry, so very hungry." I managed to get to my feet, my mind racing. I had to get out of here, had to get to my bike, but the man was between me and my only escape route. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Take my wallet, take my phone, just let me go, okay?" He shook his head, a sad smile twisting his lips. "Can't do that, kid. You've seen me now. Can't have you telling anyone." He lunged again, faster than I would have thought possible. I dodged to the side, feeling his fingers brush against my jacket as he grasped at empty air. Adrenaline surged through me. I sprinted towards my bike, my feet pounding against the pavement. I could hear him behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as I reached my bike, a hand closed around my ankle. I went down hard, my chin smacking against the curb. Stars exploded in my vision as the taste of blood filled my mouth. Rough hands grabbed me, flipping me onto my back. The man loomed over me, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger and desperation. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his hands moving towards my throat. "I'm so sorry." In that moment, survival instinct took over. My hand closed around something on the ground beside me, a piece of the broken pizza box. With all my strength, I swung it upwards, catching him in the side of the head. He reeled back, stunned. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my chin and the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm me. I threw myself onto my bike, pedaling furiously before I was even properly seated. Behind me, I heard an enraged howl, but I didn't look back. I just pedaled harder, my legs burning with the effort. The wind whipped past me as I flew down the empty streets, not daring to slow down until I was well out of the industrial district. Only when I reached the well-lit downtown area did I finally allow myself to stop, collapsing against a storefront as I gulped in great lungfuls of air. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I looked back the way I'd come, half expecting to see my attacker emerging from the shadows. But the street behind me was empty, the night quiet once more. To anyone passing by, I probably looked like just another food delivery guy taking a break between orders. They'd have no idea of the nightmare I'd just escaped. As I gave my statement to the police, as I watched them speed off towards Sycamore Lane with lights flashing and sirens blaring, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I'd nearly died tonight, all for a minimum wage job and a few bucks in tips. I quit that night, turning in my delivery bag and company shirt before I'd even left the police station. No job was worth that kind of risk. But even as I walked home in the early hours of the morning, my body aching and my nerves still on edge, I knew the experience would stay with me. Every dark alley would hold potential threats. Every late-night order would bring a flutter of panic. I had survived, yes, but a part of me, the part that saw the world as generally safe and people as generally good, had died in front of that abandoned building on Sycamore Lane. As I finally reached my apartment, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto my bed, a hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. All of this, and I never even got a tip. It was my last delivery, all right, in more ways than one. Story 4. The roar of my motorcycle's engine echoed off the brick buildings as I weaved through the city's crowded streets. My phone buzzed against my thigh, probably another notification from the delivery app. I ignored it. I had bigger problems. For the past hour, I'd been searching for an address that didn't seem to exist. 1313 Raven Street. It should have been a simple delivery, a small package marked urgent to be hand-delivered before midnight. Easy money, or so I thought. But as the minutes ticked by and midnight loomed closer, I was beginning to think I'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a late-night courier job. I pulled over to the curb, killing the engine and pulling out my phone. The app showed my destination as a pulsing red dot, supposedly just 2 blocks away. But I'd been to that spot 3 times already, and there was no 1313 Raven Street, just a gap between 1311 and 1315, filled with a graffitied wall and a rusty fire escape. As I scrolled through the delivery details one more time, movement in my side mirror caught my eye. A black sedan, sleek and expensive-looking, was crawling down the street. It passed me slowly, the tinted windows revealing nothing of its occupants. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. That car. I'd seen it before. Earlier, when I was circling the block for the 3rd time, I'd noticed it parked at the corner. And before that, I could have sworn I'd spotted it in my rearview mirror a few cars back in traffic. Coincidence, I told myself. This was a big city. Plenty of black sedans around. But as I watched the car disappear around the corner, that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger. Something wasn't right here. I fired up my bike and pulled back into traffic, determined to make one last attempt at finding this phantom address. As I approached the spot where 1313 should have been, I slowed, scrutinizing every doorway and alley. That's when I saw it, a narrow gap between buildings that I'd somehow missed before. It was barely wide enough for my bike, hidden in the shadows cast by the neighboring structures. A rusted metal sign hung crookedly above the entrance. Raven Alley. My heart raced as I guided my motorcycle into the narrow passage. This had to be it. The alley twisted and turned, the walls seeming to close in around me. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, it opened up into a small courtyard. And there, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight, was a door marked 1313. Relief washed over me as I parked my bike and approached the door. I was cutting it close. My phone showed 11:55 p.m., but I'd made it. I pulled the package from my bag, double-checking the delivery instructions before knocking. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The courtyard was eerily silent, the only sound the faint buzz of the flickering streetlight. 11:57 p.m. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I pounded on the door one last time. Hello? Delivery for 1313 Raven Street. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it. The soft click of a lock disengaging. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Hello? I called out, trying to peer inside. I have a package for... A hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing the package from my grip. Before I could react, the door slammed shut. I stood there, stunned. What the hell just happened? As I turned to leave, a glint of metal on the ground caught my eye. I bent down to examine it, a small key, old and tarnished. It must have fallen when the package was snatched. Without thinking, I pocketed the key. I'd return it tomorrow, I told myself. No sense in knocking again now. But as I walked back to my bike, that uneasy feeling returned full force. The narrow alley suddenly felt claustrophobic, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the main street. Just as I reached my motorcycle, I heard it. The low purr of an engine, growing louder. Headlights flooded the courtyard as a car pulled in, blocking the alley exit. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the vehicle, the black sedan. 2 men stepped out, their faces hard and expressionless. They wore dark suits that barely concealed the bulge of shoulder holsters. "You the courier?" one of them asked, his voice gruff. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah, that's me. I just made the delivery. If you're looking for 1313, it's right over there." The men exchanged glances. "The package," the second man said. "Where is it?" I just delivered it," I stammered. Someone took it inside. The first man stepped closer, his hand moving towards his jacket. "Don't lie to us, kid. We've been watching this place all night. Nobody's gone in or out except you." My mind raced. What was going on here? Who were these men? And if no one had entered 1313, then who had taken the package? "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I don't know what's going on, but I just delivered the package like I was supposed to. Someone opened the door, took it, and closed it again. That's all I know." The men's expressions darkened. "Search him," the first one growled. Rough hands patted me down, checking every pocket. I stood still, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. "He's clean," the second man reported. "No package." The first man cursed under his breath. "All right, kid. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with us and you're going to explain to our boss exactly what happened here. And for your sake, your story better be good." Fear gripped me as I realized the gravity of the situation. These weren't ordinary guys, and this was no ordinary delivery. I was in way over my head. As they moved to grab me, inspiration struck. The key in my pocket, maybe it was for more than just the front door. "Wait," I shouted, backing towards my bike. "I can prove I made the delivery. Just give me a second." Before they could stop me, I sprinted towards the door of 1313, fumbling in my pocket for the key. Behind me, I heard shouts and the sound of running feet. My hand shook as I jammed the key into the lock, praying it would work. For a heart-stopping moment, it stuck. Then, with a click that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence, it turned. I wrenched the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. The lock engaged automatically as I heard the men pounding on the other side. I found myself in a narrow hallway, dim emergency lights casting long shadows on peeling wallpaper. The air was stale, thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Is anyone here?" Silence was my only answer. As the pounding on the door grew more insistent, I realized I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here. It was only a matter of time before those men found a way in. I moved deeper into the building, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. Each room I passed was empty, showing signs of long abandonment. Where had the person who took the package gone? Just as despair was about to overwhelm me, I spotted it. A door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from the crack. Heart in my throat, I approached, pushing the door open slowly. The room beyond was small, dominated by a bank of old computer monitors. Most were dark, but one flickered with life, lines of code scrolling across the screen faster than I could read. And there, on a dusty desk in the corner, sat the package I had delivered. It was open, its contents spread out across the surface, stacks of papers covered in complex diagrams and strings of numbers I couldn't begin to understand. As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a voice crackled to life from a speaker I hadn't noticed. "Well done, courier. You've passed the test." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. "Test? What test? Who are you?" A chuckle came through the speaker. "Who we are isn't important. What matters is that you've proven yourself resourceful and trustworthy, qualities we value highly. The men outside," I began. "Part of the test," the voice confirmed. "Don't worry, they won't trouble you further." My mind reeled. "I don't understand. What is all this?" "An opportunity," the voice replied. "One that comes with considerable risk, but also considerable reward. The question is, are you interested?" As I stood there, surrounded by secrets I couldn't comprehend and the echoes of a danger I'd narrowly escaped, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. Whatever I decided next would change the course of my life forever. The choice was mine. And as the seconds ticked by in that dusty, hidden room, I knew that regardless of my decision, nothing would ever be the same again. My days of simple deliveries were over. A new journey, far stranger and more perilous, was about to begin. Story 5. The first hint of trouble came as I leaned into a sharp curve, my motorcycle hugging the mountain road's edge. A car horn blared behind me, angry and insistent. In my mirror, I glimpsed a sleek sports car, its driver's face twisted with impatience. Just another entitled rich guy, I thought, annoyed but not alarmed. I had no idea that in mere minutes I'd be fighting for my life against this stranger on one of the most treacherous roads in the state. "I'm Jade." a motorcycle courier for SpaceX deliveries. This run should have been routine, a package from the city to some big shots mountain retreat. The pay was good, and the chance to ride these twisting roads on my Kawasaki Ninja was a bonus. Now, as the sports car's engine roared behind me, I was starting to regret taking the job. The road narrowed as we climbed higher, sheer rock face on one side and a dizzying drop on the other. Guardrails here were more suggestion than protection. I kept my focus ahead, hyper-aware of every pebble and patch of gravel. One mistake at these speeds would be my last. The sports car, a red Ferrari I now saw, was practically on my tail. Its driver laid on the horn again, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. There was no safe place to pull over, no shoulder to speak of. Even if there was, the thought of letting this jerk bully me off the road made my blood boil. I accelerated, taking the next curve faster than was wise. The Ferrari matched my speed, staying right on me. This was beyond normal road rage. Something was very wrong here. My mind raced. Was this about the package? SpaceX dealt in sensitive deliveries, legal documents, prototypes, things people might want to intercept. But I was just a courier. I didn't know what was in the hard case strapped to my bike, and I didn't want to know. The road straightened for a moment, and the Ferrari seized its chance. It pulled alongside me, so close I could have reached out and touched it. The driver's window rolled down, and I got my first clear look at my pursuer. He was younger than I expected, probably mid-30s, with slicked back hair and designer sunglasses. But it was his expression that chilled me, a mix of fury and determination that said he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. "Pull over!" he shouted over the roar of our engines. "Now!" I shook my head and gunned the throttle. The Ninja leapt forward, but the Ferrari stayed with me effortlessly. We were doing over 80 miles per hour now on a road that rarely saw speeds above 40. This was insanity. We rounded another bend and my heart nearly stopped. A logging truck was lumbering up the mountain, taking up more than its fair share of the narrow road. There was barely room for my bike to squeeze by, let alone a car. I made a split-second decision. Leaning hard, I threaded the needle between the truck and the cliff edge. My knee almost brushed the truck's massive tires as I shot past. Behind me, I heard the screech of brakes as the Ferrari driver realized his predicament. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over. Then I heard the Ferrari's engine roar back to life. In my mirror, I saw it fishtailing as it accelerated, the driver more reckless than ever. That's when I felt it. A slight wobble in my front wheel as I took the next turn. My stomach dropped. At these speeds on this road, a wobble could only mean one thing. My brakes were failing. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I fought it down, forcing myself to think. I couldn't stop, and I couldn't outrun the Ferrari forever. I needed a plan, fast. The road ahead split. The main path continued its winding ascent, while a smaller, rougher track branched off, descending sharply. It was a service road, probably used by the park rangers. It might buy me some time, give me a chance to lose my pursuer. I made the turn at the last possible second, the Ninja's tires skidding on loose gravel. The Ferrari shot past, unable to match my maneuver. I heard the squeal of its brakes as the driver realized his mistake. The service road was even narrower than the main one, little more than a dirt track carved into the mountainside. Under normal circumstances, I would never have attempted it at speed, but these were far from normal circumstances. I weaved between potholes and rocks, the bike shuddering beneath me. Each bump sent a jolt of fear through me. Would this be the one that sent me over the edge? Behind me, I heard the Ferrari. Somehow, impossibly, he'd made the turn. The madman was actually trying to follow me down this goat track in a sports car. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and adrenaline. Every turn could have been my last. The bike's brakes were definitely shot now. I was relying solely on engine braking and my own skill to keep from flying off the mountain. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Finally, mercifully, I spotted a clearing ahead. As I burst out of the trees, I saw it was some kind of ranger station, a small cabin with a few parked vehicles. I brought the bike to a skidding halt, gravel spraying. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand as I dismounted. I yanked off my helmet, gulping in air. The sound of the Ferrari's engine grew louder. He was still coming. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. The car exploded out of the tree line, fishtailing wildly. For a moment, I thought he would plow straight into me. Then, with a horrific screech of metal on metal, he sideswiped one of the parked trucks. The Ferrari spun, flipped, and came to rest on its roof, steam hissing from its crumpled hood. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the tick of cooling metal and my own ragged breathing. Then the Ferrari's door was kicked open and the driver crawled out. He looked a mess, his fancy clothes torn, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. But the mad determination in his eyes hadn't faded one bit. "The package," he growled, staggering towards me. "Give it to me!" I backed away, my hand closing around a fallen tree branch. "Stay back," I warned. "The police are on their way." It was a bluff. I hadn't had a chance to call anyone. But maybe the mention of cops would give him pause. He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think I care about the police? You have no idea what's at stake here." "You're right," I said, hefting the branch. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. I'm just doing my job." "Your job," he spat. "Your job is going to start a war. That package, it contains proof that could bring down governments. Did you really think they'd let it be delivered without a fight?" My mind reeled. What had I gotten myself into? SpaceX had a reputation for discretion, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. The man lunged for me suddenly, his hand outstretched. I swung the branch instinctively, catching him across the chest. He stumbled back with a grunt of pain. "Last chance," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Back off, or I'll make you regret it." For a moment I thought he might actually listen. Then his hand went to his waistband and I saw the glint of a pistol. Time seemed to slow. I saw his fingers close around the grip, saw his arms start to rise. In that eternal second, 100 thoughts flashed through my mind. Regrets, fears, a desperate wish that I'd called in sick today. Then reality snapped back into focus and I moved. The branch connected with his arm just as the gun cleared his waistband. There was a deafening crack as the weapon discharged, the bullet whizzing past my ear. The gun went flying. The man howled in pain, clutching his arm. I didn't hesitate. I swung again, catching him in the side of the head. He went down hard and didn't get up. I stood there panting, the branch still raised. Slowly the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and the dawning realization of what had just happened. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped me out of my daze. Someone must have heard the gunshot and called it in. I had some fast explaining to do. As I waited for the police to arrive, I looked at the package still strapped to my bike. What secrets did it hold? What forces had I unwittingly found myself caught between? One thing was certain. My days as a simple motorcycle courier were over. Whatever was in that package, whoever was after it, I was involved now. And something told me this was only the beginning. The mountain road had led me into something far bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. As the first police car rounded the bend, lights flashing, I steeled myself for what was to come. My ordinary life had just taken an extraordinary turn, and there was no going back. Story 6. I should have known something was off the moment I saw him standing there, thumb out, a lone figure on the empty highway. But loneliness and boredom can make you do stupid things, especially on a cross-country drive. I never imagined that picking up this stranger would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. My name's Alex, and I've been driving for 3 days straight, making my way from New York to Los Angeles. My girlfriend Sarah is asleep in the passenger seat, her head lolling against the window. We're chasing our dreams. She's got an audition for a big Hollywood production, and I'm along for the ride, I guess. It's just past midnight somewhere in the middle of Nevada. The radio's been nothing but static for the last hour, and the monotony of the desert landscape is starting to play tricks on my tired eyes. That's when I see him, a tall, lanky figure illuminated by our headlights. "Sarah," I say, gently shaking her awake. "There's someone on the road." She stirs, blinking sleepily. "What? Where?" I slow the car as we approach. The man doesn't move, just stands there with his thumb out. He's wearing jeans and a faded flannel shirt, a battered backpack at his feet. Harmless enough, right? "Should we stop?" I ask Sarah. She hesitates, then nods. "Yeah, I guess. It's the middle of nowhere. We can't just leave him." I pull over, gravel crunching under our tires. The man approaches, a grateful smile on his face. He looks to be in his mid-30s with shaggy brown hair and a scruffy beard. "Thanks for stopping," he says as I roll down the window. "I've been out here for hours." "Where are you headed?" I ask. "West," he replies. As far as you're going. Sarah and I exchange a glance. It's late, we're tired, and having a stranger in the car isn't ideal. But there's something in the man's eyes, a kind of desperate hope that tugs at my conscience. Hop in, I say finally. We're going to L.A. Relief washes over his face. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me. He tosses his backpack in the trunk and climbs into the back seat. As we pull back onto the highway, I catch his eye in the rearview mirror. I'm Alex, I say. This is Sarah. Nice to meet you, he replies. I'm Jack. For the next hour or so, things are fine. Jack tells us he's a freelance photographer heading to California for a job. He's funny and charming, and even Sarah seems to relax after a while. But then I notice something odd. Every so often, when he thinks we're not paying attention, Jack whispers something. It's too quiet for me to make out the words, but I can see his lips moving in the mirror. At first, I brush it off. Maybe he's just talking to himself. Road fatigue can do strange things to a person's mind, but as time goes on, the whispering becomes more frequent, and there's something about the way he does it, head slightly bowed, eyes darting around, that sets my nerves on edge. Sarah notices too. I can tell by the way she tenses up, her hand moving to rest on my arm. We exchange a look, a silent agreement passing between us. Something's not right. Hey, Jack, I say, trying to keep my voice casual. Everything okay back there? He looks up, startled, as if he'd forgotten we were there. Yeah, fine. Why do you ask? No reason, I lie. Just checking. The atmosphere in the car has changed. The easy conversation from earlier is gone, replaced by a tense silence. I press down on the accelerator, eager to reach the next town, to be around other people. That's when I hear it. A word, barely audible, whispered from the back seat. Now, I whip my head around, heart pounding. What did you say? Jack looks confused. I didn't say anything, but I know what I heard, and judging by the look on Sarah's face, she heard it too. Pull over, she says quietly. I need some air. I nod, scanning the roadside for a safe spot. As soon as I find one, I bring the car to a stop. Sarah gets out quickly, and I follow, leaving the engine running. What do we do? She whispers once we're out of earshot. There's something wrong with him. I run a hand through my hair, mind racing. I don't know. We're in the middle of nowhere. We can't just leave him here. We can't keep driving with him either, she insists. Did you see the way he was whispering? It's like he's talking to someone who isn't there. I'm about to respond when I notice something that makes my blood run cold. Jack is no longer in the back seat, and the trunk of our car is open. Sarah, I say, my voice low and urgent. Get back in the car, now. But it's too late. Jack emerges from behind the car, and in his hand is a wicked-looking knife. I'm sorry, he says, his voice trembling. I didn't want to do it this way, but they said I have to. They won't leave me alone unless I do what they say. Who? I ask, slowly moving to put myself between him and Sarah. Who are you talking about, Jack? His eyes dart around wildly, as if seeing things we can't. The voices. They've been with me for years, telling me what to do. I thought I could escape them, but they always find me. My mind is racing, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. We're miles from anywhere, no other cars in sight. Our phones have no signal out here. We're on our own. Jack, I say, trying to keep my voice calm. You don't have to do this. We can help you. There are people who can make the voices stop. For a moment, I think I've gotten through to him. His grip on the knife loosens slightly, and a flicker of doubt crosses his face. But then his expression hardens. No, he says. No one can help. This is the only way. He lunges forward, the knife flashing in the moonlight. I react on instinct, shoving Sarah aside and meeting his charge head-on. We collide, grappling for control of the weapon. Jack is stronger than he looks, fueled by whatever madness drives him. The knife inches closer to my throat as we struggle. I can hear Sarah screaming, but it sounds distant, as if coming from miles away. Just as I think it's over, that this deserted highway will be where my story ends, I feel the knife slip. Jack loses his balance, stumbling backwards, and then, in a moment that will haunt my nightmares for years to come, he falls. The sickening crunch of impact is followed by an eerie silence. Jack lies motionless on the asphalt, the knife fallen uselessly beside him. Sarah rushes to my side, her hands shaking as she checks me for injuries. Are you okay? Oh my God, Alex, I thought. I'm all right, I assure her, though my voice sounds strange to my own ears. But Jack... We approach his body cautiously. There's no movement, no sign of life. The fall combined with the knife, it doesn't look good. What do we do? Sarah whispers, her voice thick with shock and fear. It's a question without an easy answer. We're in the middle of nowhere, with a potentially dead man who tried to kill us. If we call the police, will they believe our story? And even if they do, what will happen to our lives, our dreams? As we stand there, the weight of the decision pressing down on us, I notice something. Jack's lips are moving again, the barest whisper escaping them. I lean in closer, straining to hear. The words send a chill down my spine. Thank you for freeing me. And then nothing. Jack is gone, taking with him the voices that tormented him and leaving us with a choice that will define the rest of our lives. Sarah's hand finds mine, squeezing tightly. What do we do? She asks again. I look at her, then back at Jack's body, then out at the endless desert stretching in all directions. The night suddenly feels very dark and Los Angeles very far away. I don't know, I admit. But whatever we decide, we're in this together. As we stand there, the enormity of the situation settling over us, I realize that our journey has taken a turn we could never have anticipated. The open road, once a symbol of freedom and possibility, now stretches before us like an uncertain future, full of shadows and whispered secrets. Whatever happens next, one thing is clear. The carefree road trip we started is over. A new journey, far darker and more complex, has just begun. Story 7. The call came in at 11:42 p.m., a figure standing motionless on the Highway 27 overpass. Probably just another drunk or thrill seeker, I thought. But something in the dispatcher's voice made my skin prickle. 20 years on the force, and I've learned to trust that feeling. I never imagined that this routine call would lead to the most chilling encounter of my career. I'm Officer Mike Callahan, graveyard shift for the Millbrook Police Department. It's a quiet town most nights, but the stretch of highway that runs through it has seen its share of strange occurrences. Still, as I pulled onto the on-ramp, lights flashing but siren off, I wasn't prepared for what I was about to face. The overpass loomed ahead, a concrete arch spanning the empty highway. My headlights caught a solitary figure standing at its apex, perfectly still. Even from this distance, something seemed off about their posture, too rigid, too unnatural. I brought the cruiser to a stop about 50 yards away, not wanting to spook whoever it was. Standard procedure in these situations is to approach cautiously, assess the mental state of the individual, and try to talk them down if necessary. I've done it a dozen times before. This should have been routine, but as I stepped out of the car, that prickly feeling intensified. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm, and it was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the whisper of wind, just an eerie, oppressive silence. "Hello there," I called out, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I'm Officer Callahan. Mind if I come up and talk to you?" No response. The figure remained motionless, their back to me. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, just a dark silhouette against the night sky. I took a few steps closer, hand resting lightly on my holster. Not that I expected trouble, but 2 decades of police work teach you to be prepared for anything. "Sir? Or ma'am?" I tried again. "Who? I just want to make sure you're all right. It's not safe to be up there." Still nothing. I was close enough now to see that the figure was tall, well over 6 feet, and thin. They wore what looked like a long, dark coat that hung motionless despite the slight breeze I could now feel. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure's feet weren't touching the ground. They were hovering ever so slightly above the concrete. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, an illusion caused by fatigue and shadows. People don't float, it's just not possible. But as I stood there, rooted to the spot, the figure began to turn. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible at first, it rotated to face me. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that my years of training kicked in and I faced this impossible situation with courage and professionalism. But the truth is, I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to retreat. The face that turned towards me wasn't a face at all. Where features should have been, there was only a swirling darkness, like a void that sucked in all light. 2 pinpricks of white, like distant stars, gleamed where eyes should be. A sound filled the air, not quite a voice, but a vibration that I felt more than heard. It resonated in my bones, setting my teeth on edge and making my hair stand on end. "Officer Callahan," it said, though the void where its mouth should be never moved, "we've been waiting for you." My hand went to my gun, drawing it on pure instinct. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "Don't move." The thing, I couldn't think of it as a person anymore, cocked its head to one side, an eerily human gesture from something so alien. "Your weapon cannot harm us, Michael Callahan. We are not here to bring harm, but to bring a warning." My mind reeled. How did it know my first name? And what kind of warning could this impossible being have for me? What are you?" I managed to ask, my gun hand shaking so badly I could barely keep it aimed. "We are the Watchers," it replied. "We have stood guard over this world for millennia, intervening only when the balance is threatened. And now, Michael Callahan, that time has come again." I shook my head, trying to clear it. This couldn't be real. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel, crashed my cruiser. This was some kind of coma dream, it had to be. But the chill night air on my skin, the rough grip of my gun in my hand, it all felt too real to be a dream. "What do you mean the balance is threatened?" I found myself asking, curiosity momentarily overriding my fear. The being drifted closer, its feet never touching the ground. I stumbled back again, but forced myself not to run. Something told me that fleeing would be useless against this entity. "A convergence approaches," it said, its not voice thrumming through me. "Events set in motion long ago are coming to fruition. The veil between worlds grows thin, and what lies beyond seeks entry." None of this made sense. Veils, other worlds. It was like something out of a sci-fi novel, not the reality I knew. And yet, faced with this impossible being, I couldn't simply dismiss its words. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "I'm just a small-town cop. What can I do about any of this?" The pinpricks of light that served as its eyes seemed to intensify. "You are more than you know, Michael Callahan. In you flows the blood of the Guardians, those who once stood with us against the darkness. It is time for you to awaken to your true purpose." My head spun. This was too much, too fast. Guardians? True purpose? I was nobody special, just a guy doing his job, trying to keep his town safe. I couldn't be what this thing was saying I was. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, lowering my gun. It clearly wasn't going to do me any good anyway. I can't be what you're talking about." The being drifted even closer. I could feel a strange energy emanating from it, like static electricity, but 1,000 times stronger. "You doubt, as all do at first," it said. "But you have felt it, have you not? The strange dreams, the sense that you were meant for something more, the intuition that has kept you alive in dangerous situations." I wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat. Because it was right. All my life, I'd had dreams of other places, other times. I'd always chalked it up to an overactive imagination. And that intuition, my fellow officers called it my spidey sense, joking about how I always seemed to know when trouble was brewing. What do I need to do?" I heard myself asking, hardly believing the words coming out of my mouth. The being reached out a hand, or what passed for a hand, a tendril of that swirling darkness. "Take my hand, Michael Callahan. Accept your destiny. The world needs the Guardians once more." I stared at the outstretched appendage, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Everything in me screamed that this was insane, that I should run back to my cruiser and forget this ever happened. But something deeper, something I couldn't explain, urged me forward. A sense of rightness, of coming home to a place I'd never known I'd left. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I reached out. As my fingers touched the darkness, a jolt of energy surged through me. Images flashed before my eyes. Battles fought long ago, creatures beyond imagination, a world in peril, and through it all a sense of purpose, of belonging. This was who I was meant to be, who I had always been, without knowing it. As the visions faded, I found myself back on the overpass, but everything looked different now. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant, and I could see things, shadows moving where no shadow should be, flickers of light at the corner of my vision. The being, the Watcher, was gone, but its voice echoed in my mind. "The awakening has begun. Prepare yourself, Guardian, the battle approaches." I stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened. Part of me still wanted to believe it was all a dream or hallucination, but I could feel the change in me, the awakening of powers I didn't yet understand. As I walked back to my cruiser on shaky legs, I knew that my life would never be the same. The quiet nights patrolling Millbrook were over. A new chapter was beginning, one filled with dangers I couldn't imagine, but also with a sense of purpose I'd always longed for. I slid behind the wheel, my badge catching the light. "To protect and serve," it read. Those words held a whole new meaning now. As I pulled away from the overpass, I cast one last look in my rearview mirror. For a moment I thought I saw a tall, dark figure standing there watching me go. Then it was gone, leaving me alone with my newfound destiny. The night stretched out before me, full of shadows and secrets, but for the first time I felt ready to face whatever it might bring. Officer Mike Callahan was gone. In his place stood a guardian, awakened to his true calling. The real work was just beginning. Story 8. The neon sign of the 24/7 truck stop diner flickered weakly in the darkness, a lonely beacon on this desolate stretch of highway. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, and the promise of hot coffee and a quick meal was too tempting to pass up. I had no way of knowing that pulling into this unremarkable pit stop would plunge me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Jake, and I've been hauling freight across the country for the better part of a decade. This run was supposed to be like any other, a straight shot from Phoenix to Chicago with a trailer full of electronics. But as I eased my rig into the nearly empty parking lot, I felt a strange uneasiness settle over me. The diner looked like 100 others I'd stopped at over the years, a squat metallic building with large windows and a row of bar stools visible through the glass. But something was off. The lot was almost empty, save for a couple of beat-up sedans and a motorcycle that had seen better days. Strange for a truck stop, especially at... I glanced at my watch, 2:17 a.m. Still, I needed that coffee. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The night air was cool, a welcome change from the stuffy cab. As I approached the diner's entrance, I noticed the windows were fogged up, obscuring the view inside. Odd, given the temperature outside. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I was hit by a wave of warm, stale air. The smell of grease and coffee hung heavy, masking something else, a faint metallic odor I couldn't quite place. "Seat yourself, hun," called a voice from behind the counter. The waitress was an older woman, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't look up as she wiped down the counter with slow, mechanical movements. I slid into a booth, the vinyl seat squeaking beneath me. That's when I noticed the other patrons. There were 5 of them scattered around the diner. A man in a business suit at the counter, 2 rough-looking guys in the far booth, a young woman picking at a plate of fries, and an elderly man staring out the window. None of them were eating, none of them were talking, and all of them were staring directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Their gazes were unsettling, not hostile exactly, but intensely focused, like I was some kind of exotic animal they'd never seen before. The waitress approached, notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. Just coffee, please," I managed to say, unable to shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong here. She nodded and shuffled off. I tried to catch her eye, to maybe get some kind of reassuring smile or commentary on the weather, anything normal, but she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. As I waited for my coffee, I couldn't help but study the other customers more closely. The businessman's suit was rumpled as if he'd been wearing it for days. The 2 rough guys had the lean, hungry look of coyotes. The young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, tear tracks visible on her cheeks. And the old man by the window, I could have sworn he hadn't blinked once since I'd entered. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down without a word. I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for its warmth. "Quiet night," I said, attempting to break the oppressive silence. She paused, then slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were dull, lifeless. "It's always quiet here," she said softly. "Always." A shiver ran through me. I took a sip of coffee to steady my nerves, but nearly choked. It was ice cold. "I'm sorry," I started to say, pushing the mug away. "I think this coffee is—" "Drink it," the businessman at the counter said suddenly, his voice harsh and commanding. "You need to drink it." I stared at him, bewildered. "Excuse me." "He's right. the young woman chimed in, her voice trembling. "You have to drink it. It's the only way." "The only way? The only way for what?" My heart was pounding now, fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. I stood up, ready to make a hasty exit. "Sit down," one of the rough guys growled. "You ain't going nowhere." I looked around wildly, searching for some sign of sanity in this madness. But all I saw were those unblinking stares, all focused on me with an intensity that was almost palpable. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The old man by the window finally spoke, his voice creaky with age. "We want you to join us, Jake. We've been waiting for you." My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? I hadn't told anyone here who I was. "I don't understand," I said, backing towards the door. "I'm just passing through. I don't know any of you." The waitress stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "But we know you, Jake. We've always known you'd come. It's your time now." "My time for what?" I asked, though a part of me didn't want to know the answer. "To take your place," the businessman said, standing up. "To become part of the last stop." As he moved, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. His feet weren't touching the ground. He was hovering ever so slightly above the linoleum floor. I looked around in horror, really seeing for the first time. None of them were touching the ground. They all floated just an inch or two above the surface, as if gravity had lost its hold on them. "What are you?" I whispered, pressed against the door. "We are the forgotten," the young woman said, tears streaming down her face. "The lost souls of the highway. And now you're one of us." Suddenly the pieces clicked into place, the cold coffee, the strange smell, the way they all stared at me. This wasn't a diner, it was some kind of way station for the dead. "No," I said, shaking my head violently. "No, this isn't real. I'm not dead. I can't be dead." But even as I said it, memories started flooding back. The long hours on the road, my eyes growing heavy, the truck drifting across the center line, the blinding headlights of an oncoming car, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal. "It was quick," the old man said gently. "You didn't suffer." I slid down the door, my legs giving out beneath me. This couldn't be happening. I had a life, a family. I couldn't be dead. "Why here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why am I here and not wherever people are supposed to go when they die?" The waitress knelt beside me, her eyes softening with something like pity. "Some souls need a transition," she explained. "A place to accept what's happened before they move on. That's what the last stop is for." I looked around the diner with new eyes. How long had these souls been here? Days, years, decades? The thought was terrifying. "What happens now?" I asked, dreading the answer. "That's up to you," the businessman said. "You can accept it, drink the coffee, and move on to whatever's next, or you can stay," one of the rough guys finished. "Join us here. Wait for the next lost soul to come along." The choice loomed before me, impossibly heavy. Accept my death and face the unknown, or cling to this pale imitation of life, trapped in this limbo diner for who knows how long. I thought about my family, my wife, my kids. Would they be waiting for me on the other side? Or would I be leaving them behind forever if I moved on? With shaking hands, I reached for the coffee mug. It was still cold, but now I understood why. Nothing truly lived here, not even the coffee. "Will it hurt?" I asked, staring into the dark liquid. The young woman shook her head. "It's peaceful," she said, "like falling asleep." I raised the mug to my lips, hesitating for just a moment. Then, with a silent apology to everyone I was leaving behind, I drank. The effect was immediate. A warmth spread through me, not from the coffee, but from somewhere deep inside. The diner around me began to fade, the edges of reality blurring. The last thing I saw was the waitress, a gentle smile on her face. "Safe travels, Jake," she said softly. And then, like a light going out, the last stop diner vanished. I felt myself falling, or maybe rising. It was impossible to tell. All I knew was that I was moving on, leaving behind the limbo of the highway for whatever waited beyond. As consciousness slipped away, I had one final comforting thought. Wherever I was going, at least the coffee would be hot. Story 9. The first flash of lightning illuminated the stranded car for just a second, but it was enough to make me slam on the brakes. In that brief moment, I saw a figure hunched beside it, desperately waving for help. I should have known better. I should have remembered all those warnings about stopping for strangers on lonely roads. But the storm was getting worse, and I couldn't just leave someone out there. That decision would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. My name's Emma, and I've been driving this route between my small hometown and the city where I work for years. It's usually an uneventful 2-hour trip, but tonight was different. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the sky an ominous green before unleashing a torrent of rain and wind that made visibility next to zero. I pulled over carefully, my windshield wipers working overtime against the downpour. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out the silhouette of a person stumbling towards my car. I cracked my window just enough to hear over the storm. "Are you okay?" I called out. "Do you need help?" A face appeared at my window, a woman, probably in her 50s, her gray hair plastered to her head by the rain. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice trembling. "My car broke down and I can't get any cell service out here. Could you please call for a tow truck?" I nodded, reaching for my phone. But as I did, I realized I had no signal either. We were in a dead zone, miles from the nearest town. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't have service either, but I can give you a ride to the next town if you'd like. It's only about 20 minutes away." Relief washed over the woman's face. "That would be wonderful, thank you." I unlocked the doors and she quickly slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else, a faint, musty odor I couldn't quite place. "I'm Emma," I said, putting the car in drive. "Margaret," she replied, giving me a wan smile. "I can't thank you enough for stopping. I was beginning to think I'd be stuck out here all night." As we pulled back onto the road, I stole a glance at my new passenger. In the dim light of the dashboard, I could see that her clothes were soaked through, clinging to a thin frame. Her eyes darted nervously around the car, never quite meeting mine. "So what brings you out on a night like this?" I asked, trying to make conversation over the sound of rain pounding the roof. Margaret hesitated before answering. "I was visiting family, lost track of time, I suppose. The storm caught me by surprise." Something about her tone made me uneasy. It felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this explanation. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic swish of the wipers the only sound. The rain seemed to be getting worse, sheets of water cascading across the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. Suddenly, Margaret spoke again. "You're very kind to help a stranger like this. Not many people would stop these days." I smiled, though I kept my eyes on the treacherous road. "Well, I'd hope someone would do the same for me if I was in trouble." "Yes," she said softly. "Trouble. It finds us all eventually, doesn't it?" There was something in her voice, a weight, a sadness, that made me glance over at her. In that split second, lightning flashed again, illuminating the interior of the car. What I saw in that brief, stark moment of light made my blood run cold. Margaret's clothes weren't just wet, they were rotting, hanging off her in decayed tatters. Her skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over prominent bones. And her eyes, in that flash of lightning, they were black, empty sockets staring back at me. I jerked the wheel in shock, the car swerving dangerously on the wet road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice suddenly different, deeper, with an unnatural resonance that seemed to fill the car. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, everything's fine, just a bit of hydroplaning." My mind was racing. What had I seen? It couldn't be real. It must have been a trick of the light, my imagination running wild in the storm. People don't just turn into whatever I thought I'd seen. But as we continued down the dark highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that permeated the car. The musty smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, reminding me unpleasantly of the time I'd found a dead animal under our porch. "You know," Margaret said conversationally, as if we were just two normal people on a pleasant drive, "I've been on this road for a very long time, waiting, watching. It gets so lonely out here." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Oh? Do you live nearby then?" She laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Live? No, I wouldn't say that. Exist, perhaps. Linger, but not live, not for a long time." My hands were shaking now. I wanted to pull over, to tell her to get out, to run screaming into the night, but some instinct told me that would be a terrible mistake. "You're afraid," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "You should be, but don't worry. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need a favor." "A favor?" I repeated, hating how small my voice sounded. Yes, you see, I can't move on. I'm trapped here on this stretch of road. Have been for, decades now. But you're alive, warm, real. You could help me. I didn't want to ask. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep quiet, to ignore her, to wake up from this nightmare. But my traitorous mouth formed the words anyway. Help you how? Margaret turned to face me fully, and this time there was no lightning needed to see the truth. Her face was a ruin, flesh sagging from bone, eyes sunken and lifeless. When she spoke, I saw the glint of teeth through rotted cheeks. I need a body, Emma, a living body, to remember what it feels like, to feel the rain on my skin, the wind in my hair, to breathe again, really breathe. Just for a little while. And then I can rest. I can finally move on. Terror unlike anything I'd ever known gripped me. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. Body-snatching specters were the stuff of campfire stories, not reality. But the thing sitting next to me was all too real, its cold presence filling the car with the chill of the grave. Please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Please, I don't want this. I can't help you. I'm sorry. Margaret's hand, cold, so cold, came to rest on my arm. Oh, sweet girl, I'm afraid you don't have a choice. I've waited so long for someone like you, someone kind enough to stop, to help a stranger. Your compassion doomed you the moment you pulled over. I stomped on the brakes, the car fishtailing wildly on the wet road. For a terrifying moment, I thought we would spin out, but somehow I managed to bring us to a stop on the shoulder. Get out, I said, my voice shaking but firm. Get out of my car right now. Margaret smiled, a grotesque parody of warmth. I'm already out, Emma. I'm in you. And with that, she dissolved. There's no other word for it. One moment she was there, this horrifying specter of decay, and the next she was gone like mist evaporating in sunlight. But I could feel her. Inside me. A cold presence slithering through my veins, seeping into my bones. I clawed at my arms, my face, trying desperately to get her out. But how do you fight something that's inside you? Don't fight it, her voice whispered in my head. Just let go. It won't hurt. And it's only for a little while. Just long enough for me to remember. To feel. To live. I felt my control slipping, my own consciousness being pushed aside. With the last of my strength, I fumbled for the door handle, tumbling out onto the wet asphalt. The rain was still pouring down, soaking me instantly, but I could barely feel it. My body was moving, standing up, brushing off my clothes, but I wasn't the one controlling it. Oh, Margaret's voice said, using my mouth. Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. I screamed, but no sound came out. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, forced to watch as this thing took control. As my possessed body walked back to the car, I realized with horror that this lonely stretch of highway had claimed another victim. And now, I would be the figure by the broken-down car, waiting for the next unsuspecting Good Samaritan to stop. The storm raged on, indifferent to the nightmare unfolding beneath it. And somewhere deep inside, in a place Margaret couldn't reach, I prayed that no one else would be foolish enough to stop and help on this road ever again. Story 10. The crumbling asphalt beneath my bike wheels should have been my first warning. This street wasn't on any of my usual routes, but the app had insisted it was the fastest way to deliver this order. As I pedaled deeper into what seemed like a forgotten part of the city, the eerie silence and boarded-up buildings made my skin crawl. I had no idea that taking this shortcut would plunge me into a nightmare that would test every ounce of my courage and wit. My name's Alex, and I've been a bicycle courier for the past 2 years. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps me in shape. Tonight was supposed to be like any other, a handful of late-night deliveries before calling it quits. But as I turned onto Willow Street, a road I'd never even heard of before, everything changed. The street lamps here were few and far between, most of them flickering weakly or completely dark. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows like empty eye sockets staring down at me. There wasn't a soul in sight, not even the usual late-night stragglers or stray cats you'd expect in a city. I checked my phone again, making sure I was on the right track. The blue line of my route snaked ahead, telling me to continue straight for another half-mile. But something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too complete. Even the usual background hum of the city seemed muffled here, as if this street existed in its own pocket of reality. As I pedaled on, my unease grew. The buildings seemed to press in closer, their architectural styles shifting subtly. What had started as typical city blocks were now a mishmash of era's Victorian houses squeezed between Art Deco apartments and brutalist concrete structures. It was as if the street couldn't decide what time period it belonged to. I was about to turn back, order be damned, when I heard it, footsteps. The sound echoed off the buildings, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I slowed my bike, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of shoes on pavement, moving at a steady pace. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast silence. "Is someone there?" No response. But the footsteps continued, seeming to come from all around me now. I picked up my pace, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. This was wrong. All of this was wrong. As I rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darting between two buildings, then another on the opposite side of the street. My heart began to race. I was being surrounded. I stood up on my pedals, putting on a burst of speed. The delivery could go to hell. I needed to get out of here. But as I flew down the street, I realized with growing horror that nothing looked familiar. The turns I had taken to get here were gone, replaced by an endless straight road that seemed to stretch on forever. The footsteps were louder now, and faster. They were running, and they were getting closer. Panic gripped me as I pushed my legs to their limit, the bike's frame creaking under the strain. I chanced to look over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There were people behind me, at least a dozen, maybe more. But they weren't normal. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. And their faces. In the dim light, I couldn't make out any features. Just smooth, blank expanses where faces should be. I let out a strangled yell, fear giving me an extra burst of speed. But it wasn't enough. I could hear them right behind me now, the slap of their feet on the pavement mixing with my ragged breathing. Just as I felt a cold hand brush against my back, I spotted an alley up ahead. Without thinking, I swerved sharply, nearly losing control of the bike as I shot into the narrow passage. I heard crashes and inhuman screeches behind me as my pursuers, unable to turn as quickly, slammed into each other. The alley was dark and cluttered with trash, forcing me to slow down. I weaved between dumpsters and piles of discarded furniture, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant, but my relief was short-lived. Up ahead, the alley came to a dead end. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I was trapped. The only way out was back the way I'd come, straight into the arms of those things. As I stood there, trying desperately to catch my breath and think of a way out, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Whispers. Dozens of voices, maybe more, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from the very walls around me. I pressed myself against the dead end, my bike forgotten on the ground. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, to my horror, I saw faces beginning to form in the brickwork. Mouths, eyes, noses, pushing out of the wall as if the bricks were some kind of malleable clay. "What do you want?" I screamed, pressing my hands over my ears. "Why are you doing this?" The whispers coalesced into a single voice, raspy, ancient, and filled with a hunger that made my soul shrivel. "We want you, Alex," it said. "We want your youth, your life, your stories. We are the forgotten, the abandoned, and you have wandered into our domain." I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. "No, this isn't real. It can't be real." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The cold brick against my back, the smell of decay in the air, the faces now fully formed and staring at me with empty eyes. It was all terrifyingly real. "Join us," the voice whispered. "Become part of our story. Let us live through you." I felt something grab my ankle and looked down to see a hand emerging from the ground, its fingers like twisting roots wrapping around my leg. More hands burst from the walls, reaching for me with grasping, hungry motions. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I kicked free of the hand on my ankle and lunged for my bike. As I grabbed it, I saw the entrance to the alley filling with the blank-faced figures from before. They moved forward slowly, a wall of writhing limbs and smooth, featureless heads. I hefted the bike, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. With a scream of defiance, I hurled it at the approaching crowd. It caught the first few, sending them tumbling back into their companions. In the moment of chaos that followed, I saw my chance. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I vaulted over the fallen bike and plunged into the mass of bodies, shoving and clawing my way through. Cold hands grabbed at me, tearing my clothes and scratching my skin. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, filling my head with promises and threats. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I burst out of the alley and onto the street, my lungs burning as I gulped in the night air. Without my bike, I had no choice but to keep running. I sprinted down the middle of the road, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. The streets blurred together, each one as empty and wrong as the last. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. A working streetlight here, a normal-looking building there, the sound of distant traffic. When I finally collapsed on a familiar corner, gasping for breath, I found myself back in the city I knew. Cars passed by, their drivers giving me strange looks. A couple walked past, steering clear of the wild-eyed, disheveled man on the ground. I struggled to my feet, my whole body shaking. My phone was gone, probably lost in the alley. My clothes were torn and dirty. But I was alive. I had escaped. As I stumbled home that night, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it been real? Some kind of mass hallucination? A nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too many energy drinks? But in the days that followed, as I nursed my scratches and bruises, I knew the truth. There are places in this city, in every city, that don't appear on any map. Places where the forgotten and the abandoned hold sway. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just take a wrong turn and find yourself in their world. I quit my job as a courier the next day. These days, I stick to well-lit, busy streets. And if my GPS ever tries to route me down an unfamiliar road, I ignore it. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking. Some routes are best left abandoned. Story 11. The car sat abandoned on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking steadily in the pre-dawn gloom. As a highway patrol officer, I've seen countless stranded vehicles, but something about this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had no idea that investigating this seemingly routine situation would lead me down a rabbit hole of mystery and danger that would change my life forever. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been with the California Highway Patrol for 8 years. This particular morning started like any other, coffee in hand, cruiser humming beneath me as I patrolled my stretch of Highway 101. The summer fog was just starting to lift when I spotted the car. It was a late-model sedan, silver, with no obvious signs of damage. As I pulled up behind it, I noticed there were no plates, just a temporary tag in the window. I called in the stop and stepped out of my cruiser, one hand resting lightly on my holster out of habit. "Hello," I called out, approaching the driver's side. "Anyone in there?" No response. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. I tapped on the glass with my flashlight, the beam illuminating an empty interior, or so I thought. As I leaned in closer, I noticed something on the dashboard, a piece of paper with what looked like hurried scrawl across it. My pulse quickened. In my experience, notes left in abandoned vehicles rarely boded well. I tried the door handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. The smell hit me first as I opened the door, a mix of sweat and something metallic that made my stomach turn. I've smelled that particular combination before, and it usually means one thing: blood. But there was no blood visible in the car, no signs of a struggle, just that note on the dashboard. And now that I could see it clearly, my blood ran cold. Scrawled in jagged, urgent letters were the words, "They're coming, trust no one, find the key." Below the message was a series of numbers and letters that made no sense to me. 37 degree 14, 34.8, and 121 degree 58, 40.8 W, PHQJ ZVYQ, Waha KZ. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Who was coming? What key? And what did those coordinates and seemingly random letters mean? That's when I noticed the smell again. It was stronger now, emanating from the trunk. With a growing sense of dread, I made my way to the back of the car. The trunk release button yielded easily under my thumb. I held my breath as the trunk slowly opened, half expecting to find a body. Instead, I found nothing. The trunk was completely empty. Not even a spare tire or a jack, but the smell was overwhelming now, and there were dark stains on the trunk liner that looked suspiciously like blood. I stepped back, reaching for my radio to call this in. But before I could, something caught my eye. A small silver object glinting in the early morning light. It had fallen onto the ground when I opened the trunk. I bent down to examine it. It was a key old-fashioned and ornate, like something you'd use to wind up an antique clock. On its bow was an engraving, Veritas in tenebris luce, Latin. My high school classes were rusty, but I was pretty sure it meant truth shines in the darkness. As I stood there, holding the key and staring at the cryptic message on the dashboard, I felt like I'd stumbled into some kind of spy thriller. This wasn't a simple case of a broken-down car or even a standard criminal investigation. This was something else entirely. I should have called it in right then, should have secured the scene and waited for backup. That's what procedure dictated, but something, curiosity, instinct, or maybe just plain foolishness, made me hesitate. I found myself pulling out my personal phone instead of my radio. Those coordinates, they were a real place and not too far from here. I could be there in less than an hour. It was a bad idea. A monumentally stupid, potentially career-ending idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence. That message, they're coming. It felt urgent, like a warning. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was back in my cruiser, the key in my pocket and a picture of the dashboard message on my phone. I called in that I was taking my break early and headed towards the coordinates. As I drove, my mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who left the car there? Who were they running from? And what was so important about this key and those coordinates? The drive took me off the highway and into the hills. The roads became narrower, twisting through dense forests. My GPS eventually led me to a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in years. I parked at the end of the road and continued on foot, following the coordinates on my phone. The forest was eerily quiet, no bird song, no rustling of small animals. Just the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own increasingly rapid breathing. Finally, I reached the spot. There was nothing there, just a small clearing in the woods. I spun in a slow circle, looking for anything. A clue, a sign, something to explain why I'd been led here. That's when I saw it. A tree, larger than the others, with a peculiar knot in its trunk about chest height. A knot that looked suspiciously like a keyhole. My hand shook slightly as I took the key from my pocket. It can't be this easy, I thought, but sure enough, the key slid perfectly into the knot. I hesitated for a moment. Once I turned this key, there would be no going back. I was already way outside protocol. If I took this next step, I'd be diving headfirst into... what? A conspiracy? A criminal plot? I had no idea. But the memory of that urgent message spurred me on. I took a deep breath and turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard a click, followed by a low rumble. The ground beneath my feet began to shake. I stumbled backwards as a section of the forest floor slid away, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. I stood at the edge, shining my flashlight down. The stairs seemed to go on forever, disappearing into the gloom. The air wafting up from below was cool and damp, with a faint metallic tinge that reminded me unpleasantly of the car's trunk. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to call this in, to wait for backup. But I knew that if I left now, this entrance might disappear forever. Whatever secrets lay below would remain buried. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs. The entrance slid shut behind me with a final sounding thud, plunging me into darkness, broken only by my flashlight beam. The stairs felt endless. As I descended, the air grew colder, and that metallic smell stronger. Eventually, I reached the bottom, finding myself in a long concrete corridor that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. Fluorescent lights flickered to life as I moved forward, triggered by some unseen sensor. The walls were lined with doors, each bearing a number and a strange symbol. At the end of the corridor was a larger door with a keypad next to it. That's when I remembered the second part of the message, the seemingly random letters. On a hunch, I pulled out my phone and looked at the picture again. PHQJZYQ Wahaha KCY. It was a code, it had to be, but what kind? As I stood there, racking my brain for any memory of code-breaking techniques, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Voices and footsteps, coming from behind one of the doors. I ducked into a nearby alcove, heart pounding. The voices grew louder, and I could make out snippets of conversation. Subject is responding well to the latest tests. Need to move up the timeline. They're getting too close. What about the officer? Has she been taken care of? I froze. Were they talking about me? How could they know I was here? The footsteps passed by my hiding spot, and I caught a glimpse of two men in lab coats, deep in conversation. They reached the end of the corridor and punched in a code on the keypad. The large door slid open with a hiss, and they disappeared inside. As the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My mind was reeling. What was this place? What kind of tests were they conducting? And who were they that were getting too close? I knew I was in way over my head. This was bigger than anything I'd ever encountered, but I also knew I couldn't leave now. Whatever was happening here, it was wrong. And as an officer of the law, I had a duty to uncover the truth. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone again and looked at the code. If I could crack it, maybe I could get through that door and find some answers. As I stared at the letters, a memory surfaced from a lifetime ago, a childhood fascination with spy novels and secret codes. This looked like a simple substitution cipher. If I could just figure out the key. My eyes fell on the Latin inscription on the old key. Veritas in tenebris luce. Truth shines in the darkness. Could it be that simple? With renewed determination, I set to work on the code. Whatever secrets lay beyond that door, whatever dangers awaited me, I was going to uncover the truth. And God help anyone who tried to stop me. Story 12. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the old farmhouse, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The app said to leave the food by the barn, but something about this place made my skin crawl. I've done hundreds of deliveries, but none like this. I had no idea that this routine drop-off would plunge me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Jake, and I've been driving for Food Fast for about 6 months now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills while I figure out what I want to do with my life. Most nights, it's just a blur of suburban houses and apartment complexes. But this delivery was different from the start. The address was way out on the edge of town, down a series of increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. By the time I reached the property, my GPS was practically begging me to make a U-turn and head back to civilization. As I stepped out of my car, the silence hit me like a physical force. No traffic noise, no distant voices, not even the sound of birds or insects. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow up every sound I made. The farmhouse loomed before me, a decrepit 2-story structure that looked like it hadn't seen a lick of paint in decades. Windows, dark and lifeless, stared down at me like empty eye sockets. To my right, barely visible in the fading light, stood the barn mentioned in the delivery instructions. I grabbed the paper bag containing the order, a large pizza and 2 liters of soda, an oddly normal request for such an abnormal setting, and started towards the barn. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if my body was trying to warn me to turn back. The barn door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. As I approached, a gust of wind carried a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. It reminded me of the time I'd found a dead raccoon under our porch, that unmistakable scent of decay. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the eerie silence. "Food delivery?" No response. Just that unsettling quiet. I should have left the food and bolted right then. That's what my instincts were screaming at me to do. But some morbid curiosity, or maybe just a stubborn adherence to completing my job, made me take those final steps to the barn door. As I pushed it open, the hinges let out a prolonged creak that set my teeth on edge. The interior was dark, the last rays of sunlight barely penetrating the gloom. The smell was stronger here, mixed with the musty odor of old hay and something else I couldn't quite place. "Hello," I tried again, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. "I've got your delivery. The app said to leave it by the barn, but..." My words died in my throat as the beam of my phone's flashlight swept across the barn's interior. What I saw made my blood run cold. The barn was empty of the usual farm equipment or animals you'd expect. Instead, the space was dominated by a massive thing. It looked like a pulsating mass of flesh and metal, with tubes and wires snaking out in all directions. Parts of it glistened wetly in the light, while others clicked and whirred with mechanical precision. And there, half absorbed into this monstrosity, were people. Or what used to be people. I could make out faces, limbs, torsos, all in various stages of being consumed by the pulsating mass. I stumbled backward, the food slipping from my numb fingers. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick prank or movie set. But the smell, the sounds, it was all too visceral, too present to be fake. That's when I heard it. Voices. Panicked, pleading voices coming from within the fleshy apparatus. Help us! Please get us out of here! Run before it's too late! My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I turned to flee but found my path blocked. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the dying sunlight. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't entirely human. The lower half was normal enough, jeans and work boots. But from the waist up, the body transformed into a mess of writhing tentacles and blinking mechanical eyes. One of the tentacles held what looked like a control panel, its surface covered in pulsing lights and squirming buttons. "Ah, the delivery has arrived," it said, its voice a disturbing mix of human speech and electronic distortion. Right on time. I backed away, my mind reeling. What are you? What is all this?" The creature cocked what passed for its head, the mechanical eyes focusing on me with an unsettling intensity. "We are the future," it said. "The perfect fusion of organic and machine, and you, my friend, are the final component we need." It moved towards me with surprising speed, tentacles reaching out. I dodged to the side, adrenaline surging through my veins. My eyes darted around, looking for any means of escape. "You can't run," the creature said, almost sounding amused. "This was always your destination. From the moment you accepted this delivery, your fate was sealed." I grabbed a rusty pitchfork, leaning against the wall, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The creature paused, its tentacles writhing in what might have been amusement. "Such spirit, you'll make an excellent addition to our collective." That's when I noticed something. The control panel the creature held, it was connected to the larger mass by a thick cable. An idea, born of desperation and terror, formed in my mind. I lunged forward, swinging the pitchfork not at the creature but at the cable. The rusted tines connected with a satisfying crunch, severing the connection. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The creature let out an inhuman shriek, its tentacles flailing wildly. Behind it, the massive flesh machine began to convulse, the mechanical parts sputtering and sparking. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, ducking under the creature's thrashing limbs and out into the night. The cool air hit me like a slap to the face, snapping me out of my terror-induced daze. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. Behind me, I could hear the sound of tearing metal and squelching flesh, punctuated by inhuman screams and all too human cries. As I peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind me, I chanced a look in the rearview mirror. The barn was glowing from within, pulses of sickly green light emanating from every crack and crevice, and silhouetted against this otherworldly illumination was a writhing mass of something, its shape constantly shifting and reforming. I drove like a madman, taking turns too fast and blowing through stop signs. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by the comforting lights of normal traffic, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of what I'd just experienced hit me. I found myself alternating between hysterical laughter and choked sobs. What the hell had I just seen? Some kind of alien technology? A government experiment gone horribly wrong? Or something even more inexplicable? I knew I should call the police, report what I'd seen. But who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I'd lived through it. As I sat there trying to make sense of the insensible, my phone pinged. A new delivery request. For a moment, I stared at it in disbelief. How could the world just go on as if nothing had happened? But then, almost against my will, I found myself accepting the order. Because what else could I do? Go home and try to forget? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if that thing in the barn was coming for me? No. The only way forward was through. To keep moving, keep working, and hope that the mundane routine of everyday life would eventually drown out the memory of that horrific night. As I pulled back onto the road, heading towards my next delivery, I made a silent vow. I would never again deliver to any address I couldn't find on Google Maps, and I would definitely, absolutely never leave Food by the Barn ever again. The night stretched out before me, full of normal houses with normal people ordering normal food. And for the first time in my life, I was profoundly grateful for the mundane, because now I knew what lurked in the shadows beyond the everyday world, and I never, ever wanted to encounter it again. Story 13. The first time I noticed the car behind me, I thought nothing of it. By the third time I saw those same headlights in my rearview mirror, my heart was racing. What started as a routine late-night drive home turned into a terrifying game of cat and mouse that would push me to my limits and force me to confront a darkness I never knew existed. My name's Jess, and I work the night shift at a 24-hour diner just outside of town. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I've gotten used to the odd hours. The drive home at 3 a.m. is usually peaceful. Just me, the empty road, and the occasional truck rumbling by. But tonight was different. I first spotted the car about 10 minutes into my drive. It was too dark to make out much, just a pair of headlights in the distance. Nothing unusual. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized it was maintaining the same distance behind me, never getting closer or falling back. A tendril of unease crept up my spine. I was probably being paranoid, I told myself. Too many late-night crime shows and creepy stories shared over coffee at the diner. Still, I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than necessary. 20 minutes in, I decided to test my theory. There was a rest stop coming up, not somewhere I'd usually stop at this hour, but perfect for my purposes. I signaled and pulled in, parking under one of the harsh fluorescent lights. The car behind me drove past without slowing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. See? Just paranoia. Nothing to worry about. I waited a few minutes, using the bathroom and splashing some cold water on my face. By the time I got back on the road, I was feeling foolish for having let my imagination run wild. That feeling lasted about 5 minutes. There in my rearview mirror were those same headlights. Same distance as before, as if they'd been waiting for me. My heart started to race. This couldn't be a coincidence. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my old Honda faster than I usually dared on these winding back roads. The headlights behind me sped up to match. I tried to get a better look at the car, but all I could make out was a dark sedan. No distinctive features, no flashing lights that might indicate a police vehicle. Just an ominous presence at my back, matching my every move. My mind raced through possibilities. A drunk driver following the only other car on the road, some kind of prank or something more sinister. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call 911 only to see the dreaded "no service" message. Of course, there were always dead spots on this stretch of road. Panic started to set in. I was still a good 20 minutes from home, and the rest of the route was through some of the most isolated parts of the county. If something happened out here, no. I couldn't think like that. I needed a plan. There was a turnoff coming up, a narrow road that led to a small cluster of farms. I'd never taken it before, but I knew it eventually connected back to the main highway. Maybe I could lose my pursuer in the twists and turns. I waited until the last second before swerving onto the turnoff, not using my signal. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had worked. The headlights behind me continued straight. Then with a screech of tires, they made the turn, too. "Come on!" I shouted, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. Fear was giving way to anger now. Who did this person think they were? What gave them the right to terrorize me like this? The road narrowed, bordered on both sides by dense forest. My headlights barely penetrated the gloom ahead. I was driving faster than was safe, taking curves at speeds that made my tires squeal. But every time I checked my mirror, those implacable headlights were still there. That's when I saw it. A dirt road branching off to the right, nearly hidden by overgrown bushes. Without thinking, I made the turn, branches scraping against my car with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The road, if you could call it that, was barely wide enough for my car. Potholes and exposed roots made for a jarring ride. But for the first time in what felt like hours, I didn't see headlights behind me. I drove for another 5 minutes, the trees pressing in close on both sides. Just as I was starting to think I'd made a terrible mistake, the forest opened up into a small clearing, and there, like some kind of miracle, was an old gas station. It looked like something out of a different era, a single pump, a small building with faded advertisements plastered on its windows. But most importantly, there was a light on inside. Someone was there. I pulled up, gravel crunching under my tires, and practically fell out of the car in my haste to get inside. The bell above the door jangled as I burst in. Behind the counter stood an old man, his weathered face creased with surprise at my sudden entrance. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. Someone's been following me." The old man held up a hand, silencing me. He cocked his head to the side as if listening for something. Then, moving with surprising speed for someone his age, he flipped the sign on the door to closed and turned off the lights. "Get down," he hissed, gesturing me behind the counter. I didn't hesitate, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard for miles. From my hiding spot I heard it, the sound of an engine growing louder. Headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled into the station. I held my breath, certain that at any moment the door would burst open and my pursuer would find me. But the engine idled for a long moment, then faded as the car drove away. I stayed frozen in place, afraid to move, to breathe, to believe it was over. The old man's hand on my shoulder made me jump. "It's all right," he said softly. "They're gone, for now." I stood on shaky legs, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. But before I could voice any of them, the old man spoke again. "This isn't the first time this has happened," he said, his voice grave. "And I'm afraid it won't be the last." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are they? What do they want?" The old man sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a rickety chair. "This is going to take some explaining." Over the next hour, as the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the old man, Jack, he said his name was, told me a story that seemed impossible. A story of an ancient evil that haunted these roads, preying on lone travelers. A force that couldn't be seen or touched, but that could possess vehicles, using them to stalk its victims. "But why?" I asked, my mind reeling. "Why do this?" Jack shook his head. "Fear," he said simply. "It feeds on fear. The more terrified its victims are, the stronger it becomes." I thought back to my panic during the chase, the terror that had coursed through me. Had I been feeding this thing without even knowing it? "How do we stop it?" I asked. A sad smile crossed Jack's face. "We don't," he said. "All we can do is help its victims when we can and hope that one day it will grow weak enough to fade away." As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jack gave me directions to get back to the main road. As I prepared to leave, still shaken but somehow stronger for knowing the truth, he pressed something into my hand. It was a small charm, an intricate knot of silver. "For protection," he said. It won't stop them from chasing you, but it might give you the strength to outlast them." I clutched the charm tightly, feeling its weight in my palm. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. As I drove home, the charm hanging from my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but check for headlights behind me. But the road remained empty. I knew this wasn't over, that somewhere out there on some dark and lonely road, those headlights were waiting. But now I knew what I was facing, and next time I would be ready. Because in the end, that's all we can do in the face of darkness. Keep driving, keep fighting, and never let fear win. Story 14. The first trash can was out of place. By the time I noticed the fifth one perfectly aligned with the others, I knew something was terribly wrong. What should have been a routine garbage collection turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come, challenging everything I thought I knew about the quiet suburbs I served. My name's Mike, and I've been driving a garbage truck for Greenville Waste Management for the past decade. It's not a glamorous job, but it's honest work and it pays the bills. Most days blur together in a haze of early mornings, the rhythmic hum of the truck, and the occasional wave from bleary-eyed residents heading out to work. But this Tuesday in October was different from the start. I first noticed something off on Maple Street about an hour into my route. The trash cans were wrong. Instead of being haphazardly placed at the curb like usual, they were lined up with military precision, each one exactly the same distance from the curb, from each other, and all facing the same direction. At first I thought it might be some kind of neighborhood initiative. Maybe the Homeowners Association had sent out a memo about trash can placement. But as I continued down the street, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. It wasn't just the placement. The cans themselves were identical, same brand, same size, same pristine condition. In all my years on this route, I'd never seen such uniformity. I shook off the feeling and continued my rounds. But as I turned onto Oak Avenue, the uneasiness returned tenfold. Here, the trash cans formed a perfect circle in the middle of the cul-de-sac. I sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the bizarre arrangement. This was no HOA directive. This was something else entirely. With a deep breath, I climbed out of the cab. The morning was unusually quiet, no birds chirping, no distant traffic noise, not even the hum of air conditioners in the sweltering October heat. As I approached the circle of cans, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this felt wrong on a primal level, like I was disturbing some ancient ritual. I reached for the first can, half expecting it to be empty, but as I tilted it, I was surprised by its weight. Peering inside, I saw it was filled to the brim with dirt. Rich, dark soil that looked like it had been freshly dug. Confused and more than a little unsettled, I checked the next can. More soil, and the next, and the next. All 13 cans in the circle were filled with identical dark earth. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought it was just the usual garbage truck odors playing tricks on me. But as I stood there in that eerie circle, the scent became unmistakable. The rich, loamy smell of freshly turned earth tinged with something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. My stomach turned as I recognized the underlying odor. In my line of work, you unfortunately become familiar with the smell of death, animals caught in trash cans, the occasional horrific discovery of something worse. This smell reminded me of those grim findings, but stronger, more pervasive. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some prank or eccentric neighborhood project. Something was very, very wrong here. As I sat in the cab trying to decide what to do, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The houses lining the cul-de-sac, all their curtains were drawn, but in every window I could see the faintest movement. They were watching me. I reached for my radio, intending to call this in to dispatch, but before I could, a sharp tap on my window made me jump. Standing there was a man I'd never seen before, despite working this route for years. He was tall and thin, with pale skin that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in decades. His smile was wide and unnatural, stretching his face in a way that made my skin crawl. "Good morning, Mr. Sanitation Engineer," he said, his voice oddly melodious. "I trust you find our offering satisfactory." I stared at him, my hand frozen on the radio. "Offering?" I managed to croak out. His smile widened impossibly further. "Why, yes, the soil. It's quite special, you know, taken from significant places. We've prepared it just for you." A chill ran down my spine. The way he said significant places made me think of graveyards and crime scenes. I don't understand," I stammered. "What is all this? Who are you people?" The man's eyes gleamed with an unsettling light. "We are the caretakers," he said, as if that explained everything. "And you, my friend, have been chosen for a very important task." Before I could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate key. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into my hand. "When the time comes, you'll know how to use it." I looked down at the key, its intricate design unlike anything I'd seen before. When I looked up again, the man was gone. Heart pounding, I started the truck. I needed to get out of here, to call the police, to do something, but as I put the vehicle in gear, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't move. Not because the truck was stuck, but because my body wouldn't respond. That's when the chanting started. Low at first, barely audible over the truck's engine, but it grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. From the houses, from the perfectly arranged trash cans, from the very ground itself. The words were in no language I recognized, but their intent was clear. They were calling to something, summoning something. And then I saw them. People emerging from every house on the street. Men, women, children, all with the same pale skin and unnatural smiles as the man who'd given me the key. They formed a circle around my truck, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch. The ground began to tremble. The circle of trash cans in the center of the cul-de-sac started to sink, the earth beneath them giving way. As they disappeared into the growing hole, I saw something beginning to emerge. It was vast, its full form impossible to comprehend. Tentacles the size of tree trunks writhed from the pit, followed by something that might have been a head, if heads were the size of houses and covered in countless blinking eyes. Terror unlike anything I'd ever known gripped me. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but I could only sit there, paralyzed as the monstrosity continued to rise from the earth. That's when I felt it. The key in my hand, growing warm. No, not warm, hot, burning. Acting on instinct I didn't know I possessed, I jammed it into the truck's ignition. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The truck's engine roared to life with a sound no earthly vehicle should make. The cabin filled with a sickly green light, and I felt the vehicle begin to change around me. Metal twisted and reformed, taking on shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Suddenly I could move again, but I wasn't in control. The truck, if it could still be called that, moved of its own accord. It surged forward directly towards the emerging horror in the center of the cul-de-sac. The chanting reached a crescendo as we collided with the creature. There was a sound like reality itself tearing, a flash of light that seared my retinas, and then nothing. I came to an undetermined amount of time later, slumped over the wheel of my very ordinary, unchanged garbage truck. The cul-de-sac was empty, the houses dark and still. No trace remained of the horrific scene I'd witnessed. But the key was still in the ignition. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw my eyes glowing with the same sickly green light that had filled the cabin. I knew then that it wasn't over. That somehow I'd become part of something vast and terrifying. The caretakers had chosen me, and there was no going back. As I drove away from Maple Street, my route complete, but my life forever changed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That somewhere out there in another quiet suburb, trash cans were being arranged in perfect patterns, waiting for me, waiting for us. Because now I understood. I wasn't just a garbage man anymore. I was a guardian, a protector against horrors beyond imagination, and my work was far from over. Story 15. The neon 24-hour sign flickered weakly in the darkness, a lone beacon on this desolate stretch of highway. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and the promise of gas and maybe a strong coffee was too tempting to pass up. I had no idea that pulling into this unremarkable pit stop would plunge me into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. My name's Alex, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been on the road for the better part of 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing in my years of late-night drives and sketchy truck stops could have prepared me for what I encountered that night. It was just past 2 a.m. when I spotted the gas station. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes gritty with fatigue and my muscles aching from being cramped in the cab. The station looked like 100 others I'd stopped at over the years, a small convenience store with a couple of pumps out front, all bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. As I pulled up to the pump, I noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles around, not even parked by the store. Strange for a 24-hour place, even at this ungodly hour. Usually you'd see at least a couple of trucks or a car or two. I brushed off the unease settling in my gut, probably just a slow night. I climbed down from the cab, the cool night air a welcome change from the stuffy interior of my truck. As I started to fuel up, I kept glancing at the store. Through the large windows, I could see shelves stocked with snacks and drinks, but no sign of movement inside. With the tank full, I decided to head in for some coffee and maybe a snack to keep me going for the next few hours. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet store. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over everything. The aisles were perfectly stocked, each item aligned with an almost obsessive precision. It was as if no one had ever shopped here, everything untouched and pristine. I made my way to the coffee machine at the back of the store. As I poured myself a cup, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing right behind me, but the store was still empty, and yet the silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigerators and my own breathing. I found myself straining to hear something, anything that would indicate another human presence. That's when I noticed it. A sound so faint I wasn't sure if I was really hearing it or if my tired mind was playing tricks on me. It was coming from behind the counter, a soft, rhythmic thumping. My heart began to race. I should have left right then, gotten back in my truck and driven away as fast as I could. But curiosity, that damned human trait, got the better of me. I approached the counter slowly, my coffee forgotten on a nearby shelf. The thumping grew slightly louder as I got closer. It sounded like a heartbeat. "Hello?" I called again, leaning over the counter. "Is someone back there? Are you okay?" No response, but the thumping continued. I made a decision that I would come to regret for the rest of my life. I went around the counter. What I saw there will haunt me until the day I die. The floor behind the counter had been torn up, revealing a pit that seemed to descend into infinite darkness. And rising from that pit, pulsing with that rhythmic thumping I'd heard, was something. It was organic, that much I could tell. A mass of flesh and sinew, throbbing and writhing. Parts of it looked almost human. I could make out what might have been hands, or faces, half-formed and twisted in expressions of agony. Other parts were wholly alien, tentacles and appendages that hurt my mind to look at directly. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many hours on the road and too little sleep. But the smell, dear God, the smell. It hit me then, a stench of rotten decay so strong it made my eyes water. This was real, impossibly, horrifyingly real. I turned to run, but found my path blocked. The store clerk, or what I assumed must have been the store clerk, stood there. He looked human at first glance, but as my eyes focused, I realized with growing horror that he wasn't breathing. His skin had a waxy, artificial sheen to it, and his eyes were just painted on like a doll's. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his mouth moving, but the sound seeming to come from everywhere at once. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to push past him, but he was inhumanly strong. His hand clamped down on my arm with a grip like iron. "Don't be afraid," he said, his painted eyes somehow managing to convey an eerie intensity. "It's an honor, really, to become part of something greater, to transcend your limited human existence." The thing in the pit pulsed faster, as if excited. I could feel its hunger, its anticipation. It wanted me. It was going to consume me, make me a part of its horrific mass. In that moment of pure terror, something in me snapped. With strength born of desperate survival instinct, I wrenched my arm free from the clerk's grasp. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a heavy glass coffee pot, and swung it with all my might at the clerk's head. It connected with a sickening crunch. The clerk's head caved in, but instead of blood and bone, I saw circuitry and a strange oily fluid. He stumbled back, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I ran, vaulting over the counter and sprinting for the door. Behind me, I heard an inhuman shriek. Whether from the clerk or the thing in the pit, I couldn't tell. I burst out of the store, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I scrambled into my truck, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the gas station, tires screeching. In my rearview mirror, I saw the clerk emerge from the store. His head was still caved in, sparks flying from the exposed circuitry. He raised an arm, pointing at my retreating truck. And then, to my horror, the ground around the gas station began to ripple and shift. The asphalt cracked and heaved, and things began to emerge. Twisted, malformed creatures that defied description. They poured out of the ruptured earth, a tide of nightmarish flesh surging towards the highway. I pushed the truck to its limits, the engine straining as I floored the accelerator. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I drove for hours, far beyond my planned route. Every time I thought about stopping, I remembered the pulsing thing in the pit, the hungry void that had nearly claimed me. So I kept driving, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that hellish gas station. It's been 3 years since that night. I don't drive trucks anymore, can't bring myself to get back on the road. I've tried to convince myself that it was all a hallucination, a vivid waking dream brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear it, that soft rhythmic thumping. And I know deep in my bones that it's still out there, waiting, hungry. I've thought about reporting what I saw, but who would believe me? And more importantly, who's to say that things' influence doesn't reach far beyond that lonely gas station? How deep does the corruption go? So I keep quiet, and I stay away from highways and gas stations. But I can't shake the feeling that one day it will find me again, that what I escaped wasn't just a monster, but a destiny, a transformation. And in my darkest moments, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, a part of me is looking forward to it. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of our reality, can you ever truly be content with the mundane world again? I pray I never have to find out the answer to that question. But in the meantime, I'll keep watching the night and listening for that distant rhythmic thumping, the heartbeat of a horror that waits just out of sight, biding its time until the stars align once more.